Richard Thompson, the owner of a large motorcycle dealership in Denver, decided to do something different that day. He wanted to experience firsthand how his customers were treated, so he dressed in worn-out jeans, a faded leather jacket, and walked into his own store as just another biker looking for a new ride. None of the salesmen recognized him, and he waited patiently until a salesman, looking uninterested, finally approached him. "Hey, do you know what you're looking for, or are you just browsing?" the salesman asked with little enthusiasm. Richard pointed at a shiny Harley, but before he could even ask a question, the guy sighed. "That one? Way too expensive for someone like you, man. Maybe something more affordable." The condescending tone made Richard hold back a smirk. He went ahead with the purchase without revealing his identity, curious to see how far this would go. As he filled out the paperwork, he overheard two employees whispering behind him. "Dude, if the boss saw how we treat customers, we'd be out of a job." The other one chuckled and replied, "Relax, that old man never comes down here. He just sits in his office counting money. We make the rules." Richard's heart pounded. So this was what they really thought of him? Signing the final documents, he looked up at the salesman and said calmly, "Great service. Now, could you call the owner? I'd like to thank him personally." The guy laughed, thinking it was a joke, but his face turned pale when Richard took off his sunglasses and stared at everyone around him. Silence filled the room. Richard stood up, casually spinning the keys to his new motorcycle between his fingers. "I think we need to have a talk about how you treat customers." The panic on their faces was all the confirmation he needed. His disguise had revealed more than he ever expected. Richard let the silence stretch, his eyes scanning the room as the employees squirmed under his gaze. The salesman who had dismissed him earlier gripped his clipboard so tightly his knuckles turned white. The other employee, the one who had laughed about Richard never coming downstairs, now looked like he wanted to vanish into thin air. The once lively dealership had turned eerily quiet, the hum of a distant motorcycle engine the only sound breaking the tension. You're the owner," the salesman stammered, his voice cracking slightly. He forced a weak smile, but his body language betrayed his panic. "Mr. Thompson, I didn't realize. I mean, if I had known." Richard took a slow step forward, crossing his arms. "No, you didn't," he said, his tone steady but sharp. "And that's exactly the problem, isn't it? You had no idea who I was, which means this is how you treat all customers. How many people have walked out of here because of the way you dismissed them? How many sales did this dealership lose because of your attitude?" His words cut through the room like a blade, each one landing with weight and precision. The employees exchanged nervous glances. A mechanic who had been eavesdropping from the garage subtly backed away, wanting no part in what was unfolding. The salesman, now sweating through his collar, scrambled to salvage the situation. "Sir, I swear, we were just messing around. It was all a joke. We didn't mean any harm by it." "A joke?" Richard repeated, his voice dangerously low. "You were laughing about scamming customers, about how I supposedly sit in my office counting money while you make the rules. That's not a joke. That's how you really see things. That's who you are when you think no one is watching." He took a deep breath, trying to control the frustration bubbling inside him. He had built this business from the ground up, poured years of sweat into it, only to find that some of his own employees had no respect for the values he had instilled. The salesman lowered his head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The rest of the staff stood frozen, waiting for the hammer to drop. Richard exhaled slowly, then spoke with finality. "Clock out. No. All of you. We're going to have a serious conversation tomorrow morning. And trust me, you better hope I feel generous when I decide who stays and who doesn't." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode toward his office, leaving behind a room full of stunned, panicked employees who now realized that the rules had just changed, permanently. Richard shut the office door behind him, leaning against it for a brief moment. His hands curled into fists as he inhaled deeply, trying to steady the anger pulsing through his veins. This business had been his life's work, something he had built from the ground up with nothing but determination and grit. And now, to hear his own employees, people he trusted, mocking him, mistreating customers, and running his dealership like it was their personal playground? It was a betrayal he hadn't seen coming. He strode over to his desk, pushing aside a stack of invoices before sinking into his chair. His mind replayed the conversation he had overheard, each word cutting deeper than the last. That old man never comes down here. We make the rules. Richard clenched his jaw. Had he really been so disconnected from the daily operations that his employees believed he didn't care? Sure, he handled the business side from his office, but that was because he trusted his team to uphold the values he had built this place on. Clearly, that trust had been misplaced. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice still carrying the weight of disappointment. The door creaked open, and to his surprise, it wasn't one of the employees he had just reprimanded. It was Daniel, his longest-standing salesman. An older man with graying hair and a steady presence, Daniel had been with Richard since the early days of the dealership. "Boss," Daniel said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I figured you'd want to talk." His tone was calm, but his eyes held something deeper, concern, maybe even guilt. Richard exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Tell me, Daniel, how long has this been going on? How long have these guys been treating customers like garbage while I sat up here thinking everything was running smoothly?" His voice was firm, but beneath it, there was something else. Hurt. Daniel hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "Honestly, Richard? A while. Longer than I'd like to admit. I tried to step in when I could, tried to remind them that this place isn't just about selling bikes, it's about respect. But I'm just one guy." They stopped listening. He paused before adding, "And maybe you stopped seeing it." Richard felt the weight of Daniel's words settle over him like a lead blanket. He had built this dealership from nothing, spent years shaping it into a place where motorcycle enthusiasts could feel respected. But somehow, along the way, he had lost sight of what was happening right under his nose. The betrayal stung, but what cut even deeper was the realization that he had let it happen. Running a hand over his face, he sighed. "I stopped seeing it?" He leaned forward, locking eyes with Daniel. "You think I let this place turn into a joke?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, one that Daniel, having known Richard for so long, recognized instantly. Daniel exhaled, choosing his words carefully. "I think you got comfortable. You trusted the wrong people to uphold your standards. And while you were handling the big picture, they were down here tearing apart everything you built." He shook his head, his voice filled with quiet frustration. "The problem isn't just them, Richard. It's the culture that's taken root. And that kind of thing doesn't happen overnight." Richard stared at his desk, Daniel's words cutting through his initial anger and forcing him to see the bigger issue. This wasn't just about a few bad employees, it was about leadership. His leadership. He had assumed his presence wasn't needed on the floor, that his employees would uphold the same values he did. Clearly, that had been a mistake. After a long pause, Richard leaned back in his chair. His mind was already shifting from anger to action. "All right," he said, his voice steady again. "No more sitting back. No more assumptions. Tomorrow morning, we're shaking this place from the ground up." He met Daniel's gaze. "I need to know, are you with me?" Daniel didn't hesitate. "Always." The next morning, Richard arrived at the dealership earlier than usual. The sky was still tinged with the last shades of dawn, and the parking lot was nearly empty. He stood outside for a moment, inhaling the crisp morning air, steadying himself for what was about to come. Today wasn't just another workday, it was the start of a reckoning. By the time the employees began trickling in, Richard was already inside, waiting. He had cleared his schedule, ensuring he had nothing to focus on except fixing what had gone wrong. One by one, the staff entered, their expressions shifting as they noticed the tension in the air. The ones who had mocked him the day before walked in hesitantly, clearly aware that their actions had finally caught up to them. Richard didn't waste time. Once everyone was gathered, he stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Let's get straight to it," he said, his voice firm. "Some of you have been running this place like it's your own personal playground, mistreating customers, cutting corners, and disrespecting the values this dealership was built on." He paused, letting his words settle. "That ends today." The room was silent. A few employees shifted uncomfortably, avoiding his eyes. One of the salesmen, Brian, the same one who had brushed Richard off the day before, cleared his throat. "Look, Mr. Thompson, we were just—" "Save it," Richard cut him off. "I don't want excuses. I want accountability." He folded his arms. "If you think you can't do your job with integrity, there's the door. No second chances." He gestured toward the exit. The challenge was clear. A long, heavy pause followed. Then, to everyone's surprise, Brian scoffed. "You really think you can run this place without us?" His voice dripped with arrogance. "You need us more than we need you." He glanced around, as if expecting support from his co-workers. Instead, he was met with silence, and then, slowly, Daniel stepped forward. Richard didn't flinch. He simply met Brian's gaze, unwavering. "Let's find out," he said. And just like that, the balance of power had shifted. The tension in the room was suffocating. Brian's arrogant smirk faltered when he realized that no one was coming to his defense. The very people he thought would back him up, the same ones who had laughed with him the day before, now stared at the ground, unwilling to align themselves with him. The power dynamic had shifted, and Brian was no longer in control. Richard took a slow step forward, his gaze unwavering. "You think I need you?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. "Let me make something very clear. This business was built without you, and it will thrive without you." He gestured toward the door. "So if you don't like the way things are about to change, don't waste any more of my time. Walk out now." Brian's jaw clenched, his confidence wavering. He glanced around the room again, searching for support, but found none. The silence spoke louder than words. A few other employees shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between self-preservation and loyalty to their friend. Finally, Brian scoffed, shaking his head. "Fine. Good luck running this place without us." With that, he grabbed his things and stormed toward the door. Two others hesitated for a moment before following him out. As the door swung shut behind them, Richard turned back to the remaining employees. "Anyone else?" His eyes scanned the room, challenging anyone who still had doubts. No one moved. Some looked shaken, others relieved, but there was a new energy in the air, one of quiet determination. Daniel took a step forward, his voice steady. "What now?" Richard exhaled, then straightened his shoulders. "Now," he said, "we rebuild. The right way." He looked around at the employees who had chosen to stay. "If you're here, it means you believe in this dealership. So from now on, we do things differently. No more cutting corners, no more dismissing customers, and no more toxic attitudes. We're setting a new standard." The employees nodded, some more confident than others, but the message was clear. The old way of doing things was gone. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt something he hadn't in years: hope. The dealership felt different after Brian and his followers left. The weight of their toxic influence had lifted, but in its place was an uneasy silence. The remaining employees stood uncertain, as if waiting for Richard to tell them what came next. He could see it in their eyes. Some were relieved, others nervous, and a few were probably wondering if their jobs were still safe. Richard took a deep breath, then spoke with calm authority. "Listen, I know today's been rough. Change isn't easy, and I'm not here to pretend that everything will be fixed overnight. But what I am here to do is make sure that from this moment forward, this dealership runs the way it was meant to." He glanced around the room, making eye contact with each person. "That means treating every customer with respect, working with integrity, and holding ourselves accountable." One of the younger employees, a salesman named Jake, hesitated before raising his hand. "Sir, if I'm being honest, I didn't always agree with the way Brian and the others did things, but I went along with it because it felt easier. I didn't want to get on their bad side." His voice was laced with regret. "I don't want to be that kind of employee anymore. I want to do this right." Richard nodded, appreciating the honesty. "That's all I ask," he said. "Owning up to past mistakes is the first step toward making things better. And let me be clear, anyone who's willing to put in the effort to rebuild this place the right way has my full support. No grudges, no looking back. Just forward." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. The unease that had hung in the air started to shift, replaced by something new: determination. Daniel clapped Jake on the back, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Richard felt a sense of pride stir in his chest. For the first time in a long time, it felt like his dealership was truly his again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least now, he wasn't walking it alone. Richard stood tall, facing the room filled with his staff, every eye locked on him as he prepared to make his next move. He felt the weight of Daniel's presence beside him. Solid, unwavering, a reminder of the values he had built the dealership on. But now, everything was about to change. The tension was palpable as Brian glared at Richard, his arrogance still lingering, despite the clear shift in the atmosphere. The room was thick with anticipation. This was no longer just a battle of words. It was a fight for the soul of the business. "You really think you can just walk in here and change everything?" Brian scoffed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're nothing without us. This place wouldn't be running without me." His words hung in the air like a challenge, but Richard didn't flinch. He met Brian's stare with quiet determination. "Maybe," Richard said slowly, "but I don't need you to keep this place running. You're here because I allowed it. You've had your chance. Now it's over." His voice was steady, but the finality of his words echoed in the room. The rest of the employees shifted uncomfortably, some sneaking glances at each other. They had never seen Richard like this before. So calm, so confident. It was as if the man they had once dismissed as an absentee owner had finally come into his own. Brian hesitated, clearly caught off guard. The mask of arrogance wavered for a brief moment, and that crack of vulnerability didn't go unnoticed. "You can't just throw me out," he said, his voice faltering. "I know how things work around here. You need me." Richard took a step closer, his voice low but resolute. "No. I don't need anyone who doesn't share my values. If you think you can treat people like garbage and get away with it, then you're mistaken." He looked over at Daniel, who nodded, silently acknowledging that the battle was won. Richard's decision was final. "Clock out, Brian. And don't come back." The silence in the room was deafening as Brian's face reddened, and the weight of his own pride became his downfall. The shock in his eyes was the last thing Richard saw before he stormed out of the room. As Brian walked out, Richard turned to the remaining employees. "This is your chance to make things right. We're starting fresh today. No more cutting corners, no more disrespect. If you want to stay, you follow the rules. Otherwise, you're out the door with Brian." His voice was firm, but there was no malice in it. It was a challenge to rise up or leave behind the broken culture that had festered within the dealership. He didn't wait for a response. He knew that some would leave, But those who remained would be the foundation of a new era for the dealership. The next few days at the dealership felt like an awakening. Richard had made his intentions clear, and now it was up to the remaining employees to prove themselves. There was a new air of tension, but this time it wasn't the nervous kind. It was the kind that comes with the desire to change, to be better. The people who stayed were the ones who were willing to fight for a fresh start. They were the ones who were ready to respect the values Richard had built this business on. The first few hours of the new day were quiet. Richard had gathered his staff in the morning, explaining the vision he had for the future of the dealership. "We're not just selling motorcycles," he said, his voice clear and authoritative. "We're selling an experience. We're creating a space where customers can feel heard, respected, and valued." His words resonated with those who had chosen to stay. It was clear now that the dealership's future depended not just on sales, but on the integrity of the people behind them. Daniel, ever the steady hand, was the first to speak up. "Richard, we've got your back. We're all in." The others nodded, some more eagerly than others, but Richard could see the sincerity in their eyes. This wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead would be challenging. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. He had a team, and together, they would rebuild what had been broken. The first week was a test. Richard was there every day, watching closely, ensuring that every interaction with customers was professional and respectful. The new sales tactics were a far cry from the old ways, but they were working. Customers began to notice the shift. Word spread that things were different at the dealership. Slowly but surely, the reputation Richard had once lost was being reclaimed. But it wasn't just the customers who were noticing. Richard himself was becoming more involved in the day-to-day operations. No longer was he the owner locked away in his office. He was out on the floor, talking to his staff, meeting with customers, and showing them the face of the dealership. This was his brand, his dream, and he wasn't going to let anyone tarnish it again. By the end of the week, Richard was exhausted but satisfied. The changes were starting to take hold, and while there were still many hurdles to overcome, he was beginning to see the results. The dealership was becoming a place where people wanted to work and a place where customers felt valued. Richard knew there was still much to do, but for the first time in a long time, he was hopeful for the future. The weeks that followed brought a sense of normalcy to the dealership, but Richard knew that the real test was yet to come. He had taken the first steps to rebuild the culture, but now he needed to see if the changes would stick. Every day, he watched his staff closely, paying attention not only to their performance but to the way they interacted with each other and the customers. He couldn't afford to let the progress slip away, not now. One afternoon, a customer walked in with a reputation that preceded him. Mark Dawson, a well-known businessman with a sharp tongue and a knack for demanding the best, had been on Richard's radar for years. He'd been to the dealership once before but had walked out after a disagreement with one of the previous salesmen. Now, he was back, and Richard knew this would be the ultimate test for his newly reformed team. Mark walked through the doors with the same arrogance that had earned him a reputation in the industry. He didn't even look around as he approached the counter, his eyes fixed on the first salesman he could find. "I'm looking for a new bike," Mark said bluntly, tossing a glance at the selection of motorcycles. "But I won't settle for anything less than the best. And I expect to be treated like someone who matters." Richard was watching from the corner of the room, and he saw the familiar tension in the air. This was it, the moment of truth. His team had been through the motions, but now they would have to prove that the respect and professionalism they were learning weren't just for show. As the salesman began to engage with Mark, Richard couldn't help but feel a nervous flutter in his chest. He'd worked so hard to make sure that this moment would go differently, and now he was about to find out if it would. To Richard's relief, the salesman remained calm and courteous, despite Mark's demanding tone. He listened intently to what the customer wanted, taking the time to explain the various models and features without rushing him. For the first time in a long while, Richard felt a wave of pride wash over him. His team was doing it. They were actually doing it. The respect was there, and the professionalism was shining through. As Mark finally made his decision and walked toward the counter to finalize the sale, Richard could see a change in his demeanor. He wasn't the same man who had walked in demanding to be treated as royalty. There was a mutual respect in the air now, a recognition that both sides were worthy of dignity. Richard smiled to himself. This wasn't just about bikes anymore. It was about restoring what had been lost, about proving that a business could thrive not by exploiting others but by fostering trust. The dealership had been steadily improving, and Richard was beginning to feel a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. But just when he thought things were back on track, a new challenge presented itself. It came in the form of an unexpected visitor, Catherine, his estranged sister. Richard hadn't seen her in over a decade. Their relationship had been fractured over time, with misunderstandings and unresolved issues, but now she was standing at the entrance of his dealership, looking both nervous and determined. Richard froze for a moment, unsure of how to react. Catherine had always been a reminder of everything that went wrong in his life before he built the dealership. She had walked away from the family business when things got tough, choosing her own path. He had never forgiven her for abandoning their father when he needed her most. But now, seeing her standing there, something shifted in Richard. He had no idea what brought her back, but he could tell she wasn't here to make small talk. Catherine approached him cautiously, her eyes searching for any sign of recognition. "Richard," she began, her voice tinged with hesitation, "I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk to you." There was a vulnerability in her tone that Richard hadn't expected. He didn't know what to say at first. The anger he had carried for years was still there, simmering just below the surface, but it was mixed with something else now. Curiosity, maybe even a flicker of hope. "I'm listening," Richard said, his voice guarded. His gaze was steady as he studied her, wondering why she had come back after all these years. Catherine took a deep breath before speaking again. "I know I wasn't there for you, or for Dad. I made a lot of mistakes. But I've been trying to make things right. I know it's too late to fix everything, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. And I've been thinking a lot about this place. About what you've built here." Her words hit him harder than he expected. The realization that she was acknowledging his achievements, even after everything, was a revelation he wasn't ready for. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of the past hanging between them. Richard's heart was heavy with conflicting emotions. This wasn't the conversation he had ever imagined having with Catherine, but it was the one he needed. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to let go of the past and start something new. Richard took a long breath, his mind racing as he looked at Catherine. The years of anger, frustration, and resentment weighed heavily on him. But now there was something else, an unexpected chance for healing. He had spent so much time building his business, creating a legacy, but perhaps the real work now was mending the relationships that had been broken along the way. He had never thought it would be with her, but here she was, standing before him, offering an olive branch he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. "I don't know where to begin," Richard said, his voice quieter than usual. He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. Catherine, sensing the hesitation, stepped closer. "We don't have to fix everything right now," she said gently. I want to start by telling you the truth. About why I left. About why I didn't come back sooner." Her eyes were filled with a mixture of regret and determination. Richard's heart ached as he listened. This wasn't the sister he had remembered. She wasn't the one who had turned her back on everything. They both had their reasons, and maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to make sense of it all. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to listen without the filter of anger or judgment. As Catherine spoke, revealing the pain she had carried all this time, Richard's own heart began to soften. She had been running away from her own failures, afraid to face the truth of what had happened in their family. But now, she was standing here, vulnerable and ready to face the consequences of her actions. For Richard, it was an invitation to do the same, to confront his own past, his own mistakes, and the barriers he had built up between them. "I don't know if we can ever fix everything," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm willing to try. I've spent so much time focusing on this place, on what I've built, that I forgot what really matters. I forgot about family." His words were a confession, one he had never thought he would utter. But in that moment, with Catherine standing before him, he realized it was the only thing that mattered now, the chance to rebuild, not just a business, but the bonds that had been broken. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but as Richard looked at his sister, he saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could begin to heal together. With a slow, tentative smile, Richard extended his hand to Catherine. She took it without hesitation, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something new. And that, he realized, was all he needed.